This is a story about a woman whose father left her in the snow because she wasn't worth the price of a train ticket home. He told her she was a disappointment, a plain and worthless girl who had failed him for the last time. He thought he was leaving behind a burden. What he was really leaving behind was his own salvation, though he'd never lived to know it. This is a story about how the coldest day of a woman's life can be the one that finally sets her free. If you want to know how a woman with nothing but a thin coat and a broken heart can build a life from scratch, you'll want to stay until the end. This is her story. Clara Hemlock felt the humiliation before the words were even spoken. It was there in the way Mr. Davies looked at her, his eyes skimming over her face as if it were a page of uninteresting sums. He was a man made of ledgers and profit. His waistcoat stretched tight over a prosperous belly, his face a fleshy mask of shrewd calculation. He had come to this dusty Wyoming town to inspect a potential acquisition, and Clara, it seemed, was part of the inventory. Her father, a man who saw his daughters as assets to be leveraged, had brought her here for this specific purpose, to be married off to his business partner, securing a line of credit and cementing an alliance. She was 24, and in her father's eyes, her value was depreciating with every passing year. This was his last, best offer to liquidate. Mr. Davies took a slow sip of his whiskey, the glass clicking against his teeth. The saloon was mostly empty, the mid-afternoon light casting long, dusty shadows. Her father, Thomas Hemlock, sat stiffly, a forced smile plastered on his face. "She's a good girl, Alistair," he said, his voice straining for a casual tone. "Well-bred, quiet, knows her place." Davies's eyes flicked to Clara again, then back to her father. The look was one of profound disappointment, as if he'd been shown a lame horse after being promised a champion stallion. "Quiet, yes," Davies said, his voice smooth and cold as polished stone. "But the deal, Thomas, was for an advantage. A partner's daughter who might charm influential men, who might host dinners that seal contracts. This girl looks like she'd frighten the cattle." The words landed like stones in the quiet room. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She stared at her hands, folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. She had never been a beauty, and she knew it. Her face was too serious, her frame too sturdy for the delicate fashions of the day. But to be dismissed so clinically, so publicly, was a new kind of cruelty. Her father's smile faltered, replaced by a flush of angry red that crept up his neck. "Now, Alistair, she has other qualities." "Does she?" Davies said, his tone bored. He pushed his chair back. "The arrangement is off, Thomas. I'll find my own advantages. And I suggest you find a way to make your daughter less of a liability." He stood, placed a coin on the table for his drink, and walked out of the saloon without another glance in her direction. The silence he left behind was heavy and suffocating. Thomas Hemlock stared at the swinging doors, his jaw working. The humiliation was his now, a bitter pill he had been forced to swallow in front of a man he desperately needed to impress. And like all men of his nature, he had to pass that poison on. He turned to Clara, his eyes narrowed to slits. "You," he hissed, the word full of venom. "You couldn't even do this one simple thing. Sit there and look pretty, but you can't even manage that." "Father, she started, but he cut her off. "Don't speak. You have cost me everything." He threw a few coins on the table and grabbed her arm, hauling her out of the saloon and into the biting wind. Snow had begun to fall, thick, wet flakes that melted on the muddy street. He dragged her toward the train station, his grip bruising. What are we doing? She asked, her voice trembling. I am going home, he said, his voice flat and dead. You are not. At the station, the platform was nearly deserted. The whistle of the eastbound train shrieked in the distance. He released her arm, pushing her away from him. I brought you here to be useful. You failed. I will not pay your passage back just to have you sitting in my house. Another mouth to feed. Another reminder of this failure. But where will I go? The question was a whisper. Panic was a cold fist tightening in her chest. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw no anger, no disappointment. She saw nothing at all. It was the look of a man discarding a broken tool. I don't care, he said. You are no longer my concern. He reached into his pocket, but it wasn't for a ticket. It was for his own wallet, which he checked to ensure was secure. The train was pulling in, steam hissing from its engine. He turned his back on her and walked toward the passenger car without a word of goodbye. Clara stood there on the platform, the snow starting to stick to her hair and the thin wool of her coat. She watched him climb the steps. She watched him hand his ticket to the conductor. She watched the train pull away, taking the only person she knew in this entire territory with it. That was it. 24 years of her life, and it ended here, on a wooden platform in a town whose name she barely knew, with $2 in her pocket and a snowstorm beginning to rage. She was a liability, a burden. He was right. She had failed. The wind whipped her hair across her face, stinging her cheeks. For a moment, she thought she might just stand there, until she froze. But then, a different feeling began to rise through the cold. A tiny, stubborn ember of refusal. She would not die on this platform. She would not give him the satisfaction of being right. She turned her back to the tracks and walked away from the station, away from the town, her worn boots sinking into the rapidly deepening snow. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she wasn't staying here to be pitied. The cold was a physical thing, a predator with teeth. It bit at her ears and her nose, and the thin leather of her boots offered no protection from the snow that was now halfway to her knees. Clara had been walking for what felt like hours, following a set of wagon ruts that were slowly disappearing under the white blanket. The town was a distant memory, a smudge of smoke against a darkening gray sky. Her plan, if it could be called that, was simply to put one foot in front of the other, to walk until she couldn't. The thought of freezing to death had transformed from a distant horror into a quiet, almost peaceful possibility. It would be an end to the humiliation, an end to being a burden. Her feet were numb, her hands clumsy clubs she couldn't feel. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she stumbled, falling into a deep drift. The snow was soft, like a featherbed. It would be so easy to just lie here, to close her eyes, just for a minute. That's when she heard it, the slow, rhythmic crunch of hooves in the snow, accompanied by the creak of saddle leather. She tried to push herself up, but her limbs wouldn't obey. A large shadow fell over her. She looked up to see a man on a dark horse, his form a stark silhouette against the swirling snow. He wore a heavy sheepskin coat and a hat pulled low, its brim dusted with white. He looked down at her, his face grim, etched with lines that spoke of wind and worry. He didn't look kind. He looked tired. "You planning on dying out here?" he asked. His voice was rough, like gravel scraped over stone. It wasn't a question of concern. It was a statement of fact. Clara found her voice, though it came out as a ragged whisper. "No." Could have fooled me, he grunted. He swung himself down from the horse, his movements economical and sure. He was tall, broader than her father, a man built of solid muscle and bone. He stood over her, looking her up and down, taking in her inadequate coat, her ruined boots, the absence of a bag or any kind of luggage. His eyes, a startlingly clear gray, were assessing, missing nothing. "Town's that way," he said, hooking a thumb back over his shoulder. "What are you doing out here?" "I'm leaving," she said, the words costing her a breath she didn't have. "Leaving with nothing but the clothes on your back in the middle of a blizzard? That's not leaving. That's suicide." He didn't offer a hand. He just stood there, waiting. It was another test, she realized. Another man weighing her worth, with a surge of that same stubborn refusal that had gotten her off the train platform. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, then to her knees. The world tilted violently. He still didn't help. He just watched, his expression unreadable. Finally, she was on her feet, swaying, her whole body shaking with a cold so deep it felt like it was in her bones. "I'm not dying," she repeated, more to herself than to him. He seemed to consider this for a long moment. "Where are you headed?" She had no answer for that. She just shook her head. He let out a heavy sigh, a plume of white vapor in the frigid air. "Get on the horse," he said. It wasn't an invitation, it was an order. "I can't," she stammered. I can't pay you." A flicker of something, annoyance, maybe even a sliver of dark humor, crossed his face. "I'm not a ferryman, lady. I'm not leaving you here to freeze. It'll bring the sheriffs poking around my land, and I don't have time for it. Get on." He grabbed her by the waist with one strong arm, his grip impersonal and firm, and lifted her onto the horse's back as if she weighed nothing. He swung up behind her, the heat from his body a shocking contrast to the bitter cold. He wrapped one arm around her waist to keep her steady, his touch practical, not gentle. "Hold on," he said, and nudged the horse into a slow, steady walk. They rode in silence, the only sounds the horse's breathing and the muffled thud of its hooves. Clara was pressed against him, the smell of leather and wood smoke and cold air filling her senses. It was the first time she had felt warm in hours. She should have been terrified, alone with a stranger who was taking her to a place she didn't know. But all she felt was a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. She had nothing left to fear because she had nothing left to lose. After what felt like another lifetime, a cluster of buildings emerged from the swirling snow. A sturdy-looking log house, a large barn, and a few smaller outbuildings. Smoke curled from a stone chimney. He reined the horse to a stop in front of the house and dismounted, then reached up for her. She practically fell into his arms, her legs refusing to hold her. He carried her the few steps to the porch and kicked the door open, setting her down just inside. The room was simple, dominated by a large stone fireplace where a low fire crackled. It was a man's space, functional and sparse. There was a table, a few chairs, and shelves lined with tins and supplies. He pointed to a chair by the fire. "Sit. Don't touch anything." He disappeared into another room and returned with a rough wool blanket, which he tossed at her. "Take off those boots. You'll lose your feet if you don't." She fumbled with the frozen laces, her fingers refusing to work. With an impatient sound, he knelt in front of her, pulled out a pocket knife, and simply cut the laces. He pulled the sodden boots off, his touch again impersonal but efficient. Her feet were pale and waxy. He grunted, then went to the stove and came back with a basin of lukewarm water. Put them in there, slowly. She did as she was told, a painful tingling starting in her toes. He stood and watched her for a moment. "I'm Silas," he said finally. "This is my ranch. You can stay the night. In the morning, when the storm breaks, I'll take you back to town." "I can't go back to town," she said, her voice small. He crossed his arms, his gray eyes narrowing. "Everyone's got a story. I don't need to hear yours. But you can't stay here." "I can work," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I can cook. I can clean. I can mend. I'll earn my keep." It was a desperate plea, and she hated the sound of it. He looked at her, his face a hard mask. He was weighing her again, just like Davy's, just like her father. But this time, the calculation felt different. He wasn't measuring her for charm or beauty. He was measuring her for something else. Usefulness, maybe, or just grit. "My cook quit 2 weeks ago," he said, his voice flat. "Hands are complaining. The house is a mess. You can have the cot in the pantry. You cook. You clean. You keep the fire going. You get a roof and food. No wages. We see how it goes. You cause trouble, you're out. That's the offer." It wasn't an act of charity. It was a business proposition. Pragmatic. Cold. And to Clara, it sounded like the most beautiful promise she had ever heard. It was a chance she had to earn. "I accept," she said, her voice clear and steady for the first time all day. He just nodded, then turned and went to stoke the fire, the conversation, for him, already over. The proving ground was not a single moment, but a collection of small, hard-won victories. Silas's ranch was a world unto itself, governed by the rhythms of work and weather, and Clara was an alien in it. The first morning, she woke on the narrow cot in the pantry, the smell of cured bacon and dried herbs filling the small space. The house was cold and silent. She found Silas already gone, a note scrawled on a piece of paper on the kitchen table. "Breakfast 6 a.m. Dinner 7 p.m. Don't burn the bacon." It was the only instruction she would get. The kitchen was a disaster. Dirty dishes were piled high, and a thin layer of grease covered every surface. For a moment, a wave of despair washed over her. She had claimed she could cook, but her experience was limited to the orderly kitchen of her father's house, with a maid to handle the worst of the mess. Here, she was the maid. But despair was a luxury she couldn't afford. She rolled up her sleeves and started with the water pump, the iron handle cold and stiff beneath her hands. She worked all day, a frantic blur of scrubbing, sweeping, and organizing. She found the larder surprisingly well stocked, a testament to Silas's grim foresight. By 6 o'clock, she had a passable meal ready. Beef stew, thick and hot, and a pan of cornbread that was only slightly burnt on the bottom. The 3 ranch hands who trooped in with Silas looked at her with open curiosity. They were young, weathered men who ate with a single-minded intensity, their hunger a force of nature. No one spoke during the meal. When they were done, they scraped their plates clean and left with a mumbled, "Thanks, ma'am." Silas was the last to finish. He ate slowly, deliberately. He took a piece of the cornbread, inspected its slightly charred edge, and ate it without comment. When he was done, he pushed his chair back. "The stove damper sticks," he said, by way of critique. "You have to jiggle it." And that was it. No praise, no thanks, just a practical piece of information. That was how it was with Silas. His approval wasn't given in words, but in the absence of complaint. Clara learned to read the small signs. the way he took a second helping of her biscuits, the fact that he started leaving his good coat, the one with the torn lining, on a hook by the door instead of in his room. One afternoon, she found it there, and on an impulse, took it down. Using a needle and thread from a small sewing kit she'd found, she carefully stitched the silk lining back into place, her stitches small and neat. She hung it back up before he returned. He wore the coat the next day. He never mentioned the repair, but she saw him run his thumb over the seam once when he thought she wasn't looking. That was a victory. Her biggest test came with the ledgers. She saw them on a small desk in the corner of the main room. 2 thick, leather-bound books filled with Silas's cramped, masculine script. One evening, after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and Silas was out in the barn, she dared to open one. It was a mess of numbers, a chaotic record of expenses and earnings. She, on the other hand, had a mind for figures. It was one of the few things her father had ever grudgingly praised her for, her ability to balance his household accounts to the penny. Carefully, she took a spare sheet of paper and began to work, cross-referencing entries, adding columns, finding the patterns in the chaos. She discovered he was being overcharged by the freight company in Cheyenne, a small but consistent error that, over the year, added up to a significant sum. She wrote it all down, her figures neat and clear, and left the paper tucked inside the ledger. She was terrified he would be furious at her audacity. For 2 days, he said nothing. She was convinced he was just waiting for the right moment to tell her to pack her things. Then, on the 3rd day, he came back from his weekly trip to town and dropped a small, paper-wrapped parcel on the kitchen table. "Here," he grunted, not looking at her. She unwrapped it. Inside was a pair of sturdy leather work boots, brand new, and a small tin of conditioning grease. They looked like they would fit perfectly. "You can't do your work in those city shoes," he said, turning away to hang up his coat. "And I sent a letter to the freight company. You were right." Her heart swelled with a feeling so fierce it almost hurt. It wasn't kindness, not in the way most people understood it. It was respect. He had seen her competence, and he had acknowledged it. That was more valuable than any soft word. She was becoming not just a fixture, but a part of the machinery of the ranch. The hands started talking to her, telling her stories about a stubborn bull or a coming storm. The youngest, a boy named Jesse with a shock of red hair, started calling her Miss Clara and would bring her wildflowers he found near the creek. She was earning her place, not with pleas or tears, but with her own 2 hands. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't a burden. She was the woman who mended the coats, who baked the bread, and who knew how to make the numbers add up right. And in this small, harsh world, that was a kind of power. Summer bled into autumn, the days growing shorter, the air crisp with the promise of cold to come. Clara had been at the ranch for nearly 5 months, and the life she'd known before felt like a story someone else had lived. She had fallen into a rhythm, a routine of hard work that was more satisfying than anything she had ever known. The pantry cot had been replaced by a small, private room at the back of the house that she had cleaned and made her own. She was no longer a temporary guest. She was a part of the place. The change was most evident in her hands. They were no longer the soft, pale hands of a gentleman's daughter, but were now calloused and capable, familiar with the weight of an iron skillet and the prick of a needle. She saw her reflection one day in a pane of glass and barely recognized the woman looking back. Her face was leaner, tanned by the sun, and her eyes held a new kind of calm. This was a woman who knew her own worth, because she had built it from nothing. The peace, of course, couldn't last. The outside world had a way of intruding, even in a place as remote as Silas's valley. The intrusion came on a bright, cold Tuesday, in the form of a polished black buggy that looked ridiculously out of place pulled up in front of the rustic log house. Clara was kneading dough in the kitchen when she saw it arrive. A man in a city suit stepped out, followed by another older man whose face made the blood in her veins turn to ice. It was her father. He looked thinner, more careworn, but his back was just as straight, his expression just as imperious. He was accompanied by Mr. Davies. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She felt a phantom chill, the memory of the train platform and the falling snow. She wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch just as Silas came around from the barn, his face a thundercloud. He had seen the buggy too. Her father's eyes landed on her, and his lip curled in a faint sneer. He took in her simple dress, her apron, her work-roughened hands. "Clara," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "So this is what you've been reduced to, a homesteader's housekeeper." "I work here," she said, her voice steady. She would not let him see her fear. She would not be that girl on the platform ever again. "Indeed," Mr. Davies said, his voice as smooth and oily as ever. He smiled, a predatory little expression that didn't reach his eyes. "We've been looking for you, my dear. Your father was worried sick." It was a lie so blatant it was almost laughable. Silas moved to stand beside her on the porch, his presence a solid, unmovable wall. He didn't say a word, just crossed his arms and looked at the two men as if they were coyotes sniffing around his chicken coop. "What do you want, Hemlock?" Silas asked, his voice low and dangerous. Thomas Hemlock ignored him, keeping his focus on Clara. "We've come to take you home. All is forgiven. We have reconsidered our arrangement." "What he means," Davies cut in, stepping forward, "is that circumstances have changed. There's a piece of land adjacent to this one, belonging to the railroad. I have an opportunity to acquire it, but the deal requires a certain familial connection to the territory. Marrying a local girl, for instance." Suddenly it all made sense. She wasn't a daughter to be rescued. She was a tool to be used again. Her value had been recalculated. She was no longer a liability, but an asset in a new scheme. The cold fury that filled her was a clean, sharp thing. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it echoed in the tense silence. Her father's face tightened. "Don't be a fool, girl. This is your last chance at a respectable life. You will come with us." "I have a respectable life," she retorted, gesturing to the house, the barn, the vast expanse of the valley around them. "One that I've made for myself. Living in sin with this farmer?" Davies sneered, finally looking at Silas with open contempt. "That's not respectability. That's ruin." The confrontation was escalating, a public spectacle designed to shame her into submission. This was their weapon. Social pressure, the threat of a ruined reputation. They believed she was still the same woman who would crumble under the weight of their judgment. They were wrong. "What I do is my business," Clara said, her voice ringing with a newfound strength. "This is my home now. You are not welcome here. Please leave." "She is my daughter," her father thundered, his face turning purple with rage. "She will do as I say." "She's a grown woman," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "And she said no. This is my property. You've got 1 minute to get your buggy off it before I help you." Davies held up a placating hand, though his eyes were cold with malice. There's no need for threats. We will go. For now. But Clara, think about this. Think about what people in town will say when they hear about this arrangement. Think about your future. He was planting a seed of poison, hoping it would fester. He turned and climbed back into the buggy. Her father gave her one last look, a look of pure, undiluted hatred. "You have always been a disappointment," he spat, "and you always will be." Then he too got into the buggy, and they rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a suffocating silence in their wake. Clara stood on the porch, trembling, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of the confrontation. She had stood her ground. She hadn't backed down. She had publicly declared her choice. Silas was still beside her, a silent guardian. He hadn't fought her battle for her, but he had stood with her while she fought it. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice quiet. "You did good." It was more praise than he had given her in 5 months. It was enough. That night, the house felt too quiet. The confrontation had left a humming tension in the air, an unspoken question hanging between them. After she'd cleaned up the dinner dishes and the hands had retired to the bunkhouse, Clara found she couldn't settle. The poisoned words of her father and Mr. Davies echoed in her mind. Living in sin. Ruin. She knew Silas was still awake. She could see the faint glow of his lamp from under his bedroom door. She sat at the kitchen table, staring into the dying embers of the cook stove, feeling a profound and unsettling loneliness. The door to his room creaked open. He came out, not dressed for bed, but still in his work pants and shirt, his sleeves rolled up. He didn't seem surprised to see her there. He walked to the stove, poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot she'd left warming, and set one down in front of her. He sat across from her, his large hands wrapped around the warm mug. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the ticking of the mantel clock. "You shouldn't listen to them," he said finally, his voice rough. "They're city men. Their words don't mean much out here." "It isn't just their words," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's what people will think, what they'll say." He took a slow sip of his coffee. "Let them talk. Talk is cheap. Doesn't put food on the table or keep the winter cold out." "For a man, maybe," she countered, looking at him directly. "For a woman, a reputation is all she has." He met her gaze, and his gray eyes were serious, the usual hardness in them softened by the lamplight. "You've got more than that," he said. "You've got grit. That's worth more than any reputation." The simple, unadorned compliment struck her more deeply than any flowery praise ever could have. It was a statement of fact, a recognition of the quality he valued most. She looked down at her cup, a lump forming in her throat. "Why did you let me stay, Silas? That first day. Why didn't you just take me back to town?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, heavier. "I know what it's like to have nowhere to go." He stared into his coffee cup as if seeing a memory there. "My wife, Sarah, she came from back east. Her family didn't approve of her marrying a farmer, a man with nothing but a piece of land and a lot of debt. They told her if she left with me, she shouldn't ever come back." He paused, the silence stretching. "We had a good few years, built this house together, had a daughter, little Molly." He said the name softly, a name that felt sacred and heavy on his tongue. "Then the fever came through the valley 4 winters ago. It took them both in the same week. First Molly, then Sarah. I buried them myself up on the ridge. The confession was stark, stripped of any self-pity. It was a raw, brutal fact, and he laid it on the table between them like a stone. This was the source of his silence, the reason for the wall he kept around himself. It wasn't hardness, it was grief. A grief so profound it had hollowed him out. After that, he continued, his voice barely audible, I didn't have much use for people. They leave. One way or another, they always leave. It's easier to just be on your own. He finally looked up at her, and the vulnerability in his eyes was a thing she had never seen before. It was a glimpse into the deep, quiet well of his pain. When I found you out there in the snow, you had that look on your face. The same look I had after I buried them. The look of someone who's had the whole world pulled out from under them. He cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the depth of his own admission. I figured you'd earned a chance to find your footing again. That's all. That was it. The emotional breakthrough. He wasn't just a gruff, pragmatic rancher. He was a man who had loved and lost with a ferocity that had nearly broken him. He had seen a flicker of his own pain in her, and against his better judgment, he had offered her shelter. Not out of pity, but out of a shared, unspoken understanding of loss. In that moment, the entire dynamic between them shifted. He was no longer just her employer, and she was no longer just his housekeeper. They were two lonely people, survivors of different kinds of wreckage, sitting together in a quiet kitchen in the middle of the night. She reached across the table and, for the first time, touched his hand. Her fingers rested lightly on his calloused knuckles. He didn't pull away. He simply turned his hand over and let it rest there, his thumb brushing gently against hers. It was a small gesture, but it was everything. A silent acknowledgement. A promise of shared solitude, if nothing else. And for now, that was more than enough. The next few days passed in a state of suspended animation. The threat of her father's return loomed, but the quiet confession in the kitchen had forged a new, unspoken alliance between Clara and Silas. They worked side by side, a comfortable silence replacing the old, cautious distance. There was a new awareness, a current of feeling that ran just beneath the surface of their daily routines. The crisis came, as it always does, when she least expected it. A letter arrived, delivered by a boy on horseback from town. It was addressed to her. The handwriting was her father's. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The letter was short and devoid of any sentiment. It was an ultimatum. Mr. Davies had secured the land deal, contingent on their marriage within the month. Her father had enclosed a train ticket back to Cheyenne and a bank draft for $100, enough for a new dress and travel expenses. The final lines were the ones that stole her breath. This is your final opportunity to fulfill your duty to this family and secure a respectable future. Should you refuse, you will be formally disowned. I will see to it that your name is struck from the family Bible. You will, in all respects, cease to be my daughter. Make your choice. It was the choice she had been running from her entire life, now laid bare in black ink. On one side was the world she had been raised to value: respectability, financial security, the approval of society. It was a gilded cage, but a cage with familiar bars. Marrying Davies would be a loveless, transactional existence, but it would be safe. She would be Mrs. Alistair Davies, a woman of standing. No one would ever call her a ruined housekeeper again. On the other side was this life, a life of hard labor, of isolation, of uncertain futures. A life with a quiet, broken man who offered no promises of love or forever, only the steady presence of his respect. It was a life she was building with her own hands, but it was a fragile one. Her father and Davies could destroy it with whispers and lies. They could make it impossible for Silas to do business, could turn the whole town against them. Choosing Silas meant choosing the harder path, the one with no guarantees. It meant choosing authenticity over security. She stood in the kitchen, the letter clutched in her hand, the paper rattling with her shaking. She thought of Mr. Davies's cold eyes and her father's dismissive sneer. Then she thought of Silas's calloused hand covering hers on the table, the way he'd said, "You've got grit." One life was an ending. The other was a beginning. Silas came in from the barn, stamping the dirt from his boots. He saw the letter in her hand, the look on her face, and he knew. He didn't ask what it said. He just waited. "He wants me to go back," she said, her voice thin. "He's offered me a respectable life." Silas's face was unreadable, a mask of stone. He nodded slowly. "It's a good offer," he said, his voice flat. "Davies is a rich man. You'd be safe." He was pushing her away. The old fear, the one he'd confessed to her, they always leave, was making him do it. He was giving her an out, preparing himself for the inevitable loss. He was testing her, and perhaps himself. It was a moment of profound emotional crisis for them both. He was offering her the choice he thought she should make, the logical one, while his eyes betrayed the hope that she would refuse. And in that moment, she saw it all with perfect clarity. Safety was an illusion. Respectability was a prison. The only thing that was real was the ground beneath her feet and the quiet strength of the man standing in front of her. She looked him straight in the eye. "Is that what you want, Silas? For me to go?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and sharp. His jaw clenched. For a long second he said nothing. Then the mask cracked. A raw, desperate emotion flashed in his eyes. "No," he said, the word torn from him. "But it's not my choice to make." That was all she needed to hear. She walked over to the cook stove, opened the iron door, and tossed the letter and the bank draft into the flames. She watched them curl, blacken, and turn to ash. The train ticket was last. It flared brightly for a second, then was gone. She turned back to him, her heart pounding with a terrifying, exhilarating certainty. "I'm not going back," she said. "I'm staying here." She had made her choice. She had chosen authenticity. She had chosen the harder path. She had chosen him. A wave of relief so profound it was almost pain washed over Silas's face. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He didn't speak. He simply reached out and pulled her to him, his arms wrapping around her in a fierce, protective embrace. He buried his face in her hair, and she could feel the shudder that ran through his powerful frame. It wasn't a lover's embrace. Not yet. It was the embrace of a man who had been alone for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone choose to stay. He was holding on to her as if he were drowning, and she was the only solid thing in a world of water. She held him back just as tightly, her choice made not in words, but in fire and ash. The public declaration came a week later. Having received no reply, her father and Mr. Davies decided to force the issue. They chose the perfect venue for their assault, the town's general store on a Saturday morning, when it would be crowded with ranchers and their families stocking up on supplies. Clara and Silas had ridden in together in the wagon, a rare trip for her. She needed fabric and thread, and Silas needed to speak to the blacksmith. The air between them, since she'd burned the letter, had been charged with a new intimacy. Though little had been said, their relationship was still being built through shared looks and quiet actions, not grand pronouncements. They were standing at the counter, speaking with the proprietor, when the bell over the door jingled. Her father and Davies walked in, dressed in their fine city clothes, looking utterly out of place. A hush fell over the store. Everyone knew who Silas was, and by now, most knew the story of the woman who worked for him. Davies smiled his predatory smile, letting his gaze sweep over the assembled townspeople. This was theater, and he was the lead actor. "Ah, Miss Hemlock," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "We were so hoping to find you. Your father has been worried. It's time to put an end to this unfortunate situation." Clara felt a flush of anger. He was intentionally framing her as a lost, foolish girl who needed rescuing. Silas put a steadying hand on the small of her back, a silent signal of support. "There is no situation, Mr. Davies," Clara said, her voice clear and carrying in the quiet store. "I have made my choice." "A choice to live in shame?" her father cut in, his voice sharp with manufactured piety. "To abandon your family and your duties for this?" He waved a dismissive hand in Silas's direction. "The good people of this town deserve to know the truth. This man took you in when you were vulnerable, and he has taken advantage of you." Several people in the store shifted uncomfortably. Reputation was currency here, and her father was trying to bankrupt them both. This was the public reckoning. She would not hide. She would not be ashamed. She stepped forward, away from the counter, away from the protective shield of Silas's body, so she was standing alone in the center of the room. She was refusing to be defended. She would defend herself. "No one has taken advantage of me," she said, her eyes meeting her father's. "Mr. Blackwood," she nodded at Silas, "offered me a job when I had nothing. I have earned my keep every day since. The only person who ever abandoned me was you. You left me at a train station in a snowstorm with no money and no ticket home." A collective gasp went through the small crowd. This was a detail the town hadn't known, a piece of cruelty that shifted their sympathies in an instant. Her father's face went pale. "That is a lie." "Is it?" Clara pressed. "Were you not in the saloon with Mr. Davies when he called me a liability? Did you not tell me I was no longer your concern?" Her words were sharp, precise, and devastatingly true. Davies, seeing he was losing the audience, tried a different tactic. He turned his sneer on Silas. "And what are your intentions toward this woman, Blackwood? You have her living in your home, unchaperoned. What kind of arrangement is that?" It was the final, poisonous arrow aimed at the heart of their new, fragile connection. The whole store waited for Silas's answer. Clara held her breath. She didn't know what he would say. They had never spoken of it. He could say she was his housekeeper, a truthful but unsatisfying answer that would leave them vulnerable to gossip. He could say nothing at all. Instead, Silas stepped forward to stand beside her again. He looked not at Davies or her father, but at Clara. His gray eyes were serious and completely sincere. Then he turned his gaze to the crowd, his voice low and steady, a bedrock of certainty. "She is my wife." The words settled over the room, absolute and irrefutable. It wasn't true, not yet, but it was a vow, a public declaration of intent more binding than any private whisper. It was a shield, a claim, a promise. He was choosing her, publicly and without hesitation. He was refusing to let them define her. Mr. Davies's jaw dropped. Her father looked as if he'd been struck. They had no response to this. Their power, built on insinuation and social shame, had just been demolished by one simple, powerful sentence. The store proprietor, A stout man with a kind face was the first to break the silence. "Well," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Congratulations, you two." A murmur of agreement went through the crowd. A woman in a calico dress smiled at Clara. The public opinion had turned decisively. Her father and Davies stood there utterly defeated. Their weapons had been turned against them. Without another word, they turned and stalked out of the store, the bell on the door jingling their ignominious retreat. Clara looked at Silas, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. He had just bound himself to her in front of the entire town. He met her gaze, and a small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. In the middle of the general store, surrounded by sacks of flour and barrels of nails, they had just announced their future. The emotional peak wasn't a kiss or a passionate speech. It was a simple, declarative sentence. "She is my wife." And in that moment, it became the truest thing in the world. They were married by the circuit judge 2 weeks later, in a simple ceremony in the town's small courthouse. The proprietor of the general store and his wife stood as their witnesses. Clara wore a new dress made from the blue calico fabric she'd bought that fateful day, her hands steady as she'd stitched it herself. Silas wore a clean shirt and his good coat, the one she had mended. He was awkward and solemn through the ceremony, but when he slid the simple gold band onto her finger, his hand was firm and warm. Their life together settled into a new kind of rhythm, one marked by a quiet, deepening affection. The declaration in the store had changed everything. There was no more uncertainty. They were a unit, a partnership in every sense of the word. They worked the ranch together, Silas teaching her the things she didn't know: how to read the sky for weather, how to spot a sick calf, how to handle the finances of a working ranch. In turn, she brought a sense of order and warmth to his solitary existence, turning the sparse house into a true home. Months turned into a year, then 2. Her father never wrote again. Word drifted back to town that his business ventures had soured, and that Mr. Davies had cut ties with him after the failed land deal. Thomas Hemlock, a man who measured worth in dollars and connections, had lost both. He faded from their lives, becoming a ghost, a cautionary tale. The first winter of their marriage was hard, with heavy snows that tested their resources. But they faced it together. It was during that winter, huddled by the fire during a long, howling blizzard, that Silas finally spoke the words she had never asked to hear. He took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I love you, Clara," he said, his voice rough with emotion he still found difficult to express. I never thought I'd have this again." She leaned her head on his shoulder, her heart full. "I love you too, Silas." The antagonist was gone, but the past still had one final echo. A letter arrived late one spring, 3 years after they were married. It was from a doctor in Cheyenne. Her father was dying. He was penniless, living in a charity ward, and had asked to see her. Silas read the letter over her shoulder, his arm a comforting weight around her. "You don't have to go," he said quietly. "I know," she replied. But she also knew she had to, not for him, but for herself, to close the final chapter of that old life. She made the journey alone, taking the train, the same line that had brought her here in shame and abandonment. The man she found in the hospital bed was a shrunken, frail version of the imposing figure she remembered. He was weak, his voice a reedy whisper. He looked at her, his eyes clouded with pain and regret. "Clara," he rasped, "I was wrong." There was no grand speech, no detailed apology, just that one simple admission. He had built his life on being right, on calculations and leverage, and in the end, it had all amounted to nothing. He had discarded the one thing of true value he'd ever possessed. "I know, Father," she said, and took his thin, cold hand in hers. She felt no anger, no triumph, only a vast, quiet pity. She forgave him, not because he had earned it, but because she had. Her own happiness had made the old wounds irrelevant. She stayed with him until the end, a few days later, then arranged for a simple burial. When she stepped back onto the train to go home, she felt lighter. The ghost was finally laid to rest. Silas was waiting for her on the platform at the station, the same platform where her father had left her. But this time, she wasn't alone. He was there, his familiar, solid presence a beacon. He lifted her down from the train car and held her, his embrace warm and sure. The circle was complete. The place of her deepest humiliation had become the site of her homecoming. As they rode back to the ranch, the valley opened up before them, green and vibrant with new life. And Clara knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that she was finally, truly, home. A year later, the sound of a baby's cry filled the log house. They named him Samuel, a sturdy, happy boy with his father's serious gray eyes. The family she had chosen was now complete. Clara often found herself looking at her hands. They told the story of her life better than any words could. They were not the hands of Clara Hemlock, the disappointed daughter, the failed asset. They were the hands of Clara Blackwood, a rancher's wife, a mother, a partner. They were strong, capable, marked with the small scars and calluses that came from building a life from the ground up. She remembered her father's disgust at her appearance, Mr. Davies's cruel assessment of her worth. They had measured her by a set of rules she could never win by: beauty, charm, social grace. They saw value in dowries, in connections, in a woman's ability to be a pleasing ornament. They had looked at her and seen nothing. Silas had looked at her and seen something different. He hadn't seen a pretty face or a charming hostess. He saw a woman shivering in the snow who refused to die. He saw a woman who could mend a coat, balance a ledger, and stand up to bullies in a crowded store. He saw grit, and in his world, that was the only currency that mattered. He had offered her a chance, not a rescue. He had given her the opportunity to prove her own worth, and in doing so, he had given her back to herself. Her old life had been about being chosen, about waiting for a father or a husband to decide her fate. This new life was about choosing. She had chosen to walk out of that town instead of begging. She had chosen to work instead of accepting charity. She had chosen to burn the letter, to stay, to build a home in this wild, beautiful place with a quiet, good man. People often mistook Silas's silence for a lack of feeling, but she knew the truth. His love wasn't in pretty words. It was in the sturdy fence he built around her garden, in the way he always made sure the woodbox by the stove was full, in the steady presence of his hand in hers as they sat on the porch at the end of a long day, watching their son play in the dust. Her father thought he was leaving a burden behind on that train platform. He believed he was cutting a useless part of his life away. But a person is only a burden if they believe they are one. And in the coldest, most desolate moment of her life, standing alone in the snow, she had discovered a truth that would become the foundation of everything that followed. She never did. She had been cold, and she had been afraid, but she had never, not for 1 second, believed she was worthless. That refusal, that small, stubborn ember of self-worth, had been enough to light the way home. It had saved her. And in the end, it had given her everything.